3. Yep.
All right, so this is History 320, Napoleonic Europe. We're looking at the military campaigns of Napoleon. We're right now on week 10 of Thursday, talking about his Russia campaign, also known as the Patriotic War of 1812 by the Russians, but Napoleon doesn't want to call it that. The Patriotic War of 1812 was pretty important for a number of reasons. It symbolized, first of all, that Napoleon actually wasn't invincible, but it also showed at the end of it, its legacy, that he was really able to recover from pretty much anything after this, although it was pretty detrimental to his overall ability to recruit in Europe, because nobody wants to join an army that you're probably going to want to kill. So, as we've already covered, Napoleon's Russia campaign began in June of 1812. The continental system is really what started this, because the trade system between Britain and France was very tense, and so France put an embargo on Britain, known as the continental system, with the Berlin Decree in November of 1806, after Napoleon had pretty much beaten everyone else and basically beaten them into submission to say, oh no, now you have to sign on to my continental system, we're not going to trade with Britain. And Russia was a part of that until Russia realized that their economic burden was so high that they really couldn't deal with this continental system anymore. Also, Alexander I really came into his own and decided that he wasn't going to stand for any of this nonsense by Napoleon. So what you ended up having is General Kutuzov was the one who was put in charge of the Russian operations against Napoleon. And at the Battle of Borodino, it was the single bloodiest battle of the entire Napoleonic Wars. 250,000 soldiers were engaged, and there were 70,000 casualties. And in Europe in particular, this is very strange, because with gunpowder and weapons, you have to be able to supply them with all these equipment. And until this time point in history, you just really hadn't been able to pump out enough weapons, enough ammunition, enough supplies. And when Napoleon marches into Russia with 600,000 troops, it's really quite remarkable for that time period. But as we all know, he ended up arriving in Moscow, only to find out that Moscow was on fire. You see, he'd been pushing back Russia's army, and Russia didn't really want to engage him, except at the Battle of Borodino. And even then, even though Napoleon technically won, he lost so many troops that it actually hurt him in the long run. And so when he arrives at Moscow, he finds the city on fire, and he decides pretty early on that he's going to have to retreat. And there are a couple reasons why he actually retreated. The first reason is obviously that the cold's setting in, because it's October. It's not really a great time to be in Russia, especially if your enemies are burning all the farms and villages along the way, so you have nothing to eat. So what this means is that everyone's freezing. Also, there's very little food to be had. And the equipment is also a huge factor. Historian Saul David is a historian who is from BBC, and he really analyzed the issue of why Napoleon really failed in the Russian campaign, and his big belief is that he brought the wrong horseshoes. And because he brought no winter horseshoes, he ended up not actually being able to carry out an effective campaign, because horses are necessary to pull artillery. And a big thing about the Napoleonic era is this is when artillery is huge. And if you don't have artillery, you're really not going to be able to cover your retreats or do any effective operations very well. So what happened was because he didn't have these specific type of horseshoes that allowed horses to get a good grasp on the terrain, the horses ended up slipping. A lot of times they had broken legs. And so what the Russians would find when they'd come upon the baggage trains of Napoleon is a bunch of dead horses and abandoned artillery, because they just didn't have enough horses to pull them. And also Moscow was set on fire. That's a big deal. If the place that you think you're going to capture, and then that's going to be the end of the campaign, is on fire, because the very people you're fighting set their own capital on fire, you're going to have a big issue. And this is actually a point of controversy for many historians. There's some belief that the governor of Moscow actually set it on fire on order from Tsar Alexander, but we don't know that for sure. And then there are some other historians that think that the Russian partisans actually set it on fire as an act of defiance. Again, not really clear on what happened. It was probably the Russians that actually did set it on fire. It's not very likely that it was an accident. Because the whole theory was this scorched earth theory, that Tsar Alexander sent out basically a memo to the Russian forces saying, we're not going to allow Napoleon to survive. He has 600,000 troops, sure. But what happens when we burn all our villages and don't allow him any access to food or forage? Well, his army's going to starve to death, because what was Napoleon's biggest quotation that probably everyone knows? An army marches on its what?
Stomach.
Right. An army marches on its stomach, and if it doesn't have anything to feed that stomach, you're not going to be getting very far. So this was a policy that Kutuzov enforced pretty strictly, and it's also an example of very high nationalism at the time. France was well known because obviously the French Revolution garnered a lot of nationalistic support, and Russian nationalism was extremely high because everyone thought Tsar Alexander and Kutuzov were pretty cool people. The partisan leaders, Figner and Seslevin, killed their prisoners for sport. This was pretty detrimental to French morale when you have a couple options. You're going to die of cold, you're going to try your best to retreat, but that's pretty hard when you're getting shot at it, so you're probably going to die. Or you can surrender, but you don't want to surrender either because you're probably going to get shot by the people you surrender to. So it's really a catch-all category, and this caused a lot of desertion from the French ranks of them just saying, I don't want any part of this anymore. But then they typically died of cold because obviously you wander off from the main army with all the food into the wasteland that Kutuzov was created, you're not going to be getting very far. Heinrich Vossler was a French lieutenant who wrote, all stores and provisions for man and beast had been hidden or burnt, and 4/5 of the army subsisted on the flesh of exhausted, starving cattle. They also had to drink brackish waters that made the army sick, and Russian prisoners were actually eaten, which didn't make the Russians very happy. But also, it made the army pretty sick. So you have a sick army that has no artillery, that's retreating, and is in the middle of a Russian winter, which isn't great for anybody except the Mongols. Caulaincourt was Napoleon's aide, and he said that as if realizing that the army is soon going to be surrounded by swarms of Cossacks who can't be driven out for lack of light cavalry, again because all the cavalry are dead, Napoleon has got it into his head to squeeze thousands of non-existent Polish Cossacks out of the bankrupt duchy. So a big part of this is that Napoleon thought that there were these Polish Cossacks that he could just draw on from Poland, except those Polish Cossacks didn't actually exist. All the Cossacks, except for a few, were fighting on the side of the Russians, because if you look at the geography, what you have is everybody's up around this area. Napoleon starts retreating this way because he doesn't want to go this way because, again, as the Russians were retreating, they burned everything. And so if he tries to retreat the same way, he's just going to be going through a wasteland where there's nothing to eat. So he wants to go down this way because there's actually food and villages that he can pillage. Problem is if you look at the geography of where this is, he's trying to go right through there. And Kiev and this whole area is where the Cossacks live, and they're not too happy about that. And this is another significant river. This is kind of where the Cossacks hang out, and they're not a big fan of him trying to do that. So this is actually really from the beginning the entire plan of the Russians. Lieutenant Colonel Chukovich said that on an advisement to Russian command on April 2nd, 1812, really at the very beginning of the campaign, since Napoleon launched it in June, that Napoleon completely understands the traditional warfare, and this factor costs dearly to other nations. Basically, like, we don't want to fight him on his own terms, we don't want to go head-to-head with them. So it is necessary to wage against Napoleon a war to which he is not accustomed. We must base our success on an impatience that is characteristic to him. This impatience would cause him to commit errors which we must exploit at once, and move from a defensive war to an offensive one. Avoiding decisive battles, waging a guerrilla war with flying detachments, targeting the enemy's lines of operation, preventing enemy foraging, staying resolute in pursuing the war. Such should be the essence of the war, new to Napoleon, exhausting to the French, and unbearable to their allies. And this is pretty important because Napoleon has some Spanish campaigns that are going on right now with the Peninsular War, but they're not really encountering this massive partisan resistance that's happening on this scale, specifically with the Cossacks. They were Slavic Tartar horsemen who fought for Russia, led by Matvey Platov, who became the general of the cavalry. And you can see the little quote from the British envoy who thinks that they're pretty cool. And then you have the partisans who are different from the Cossacks. They're led by essentially what are paramilitary Russian forces. So you have a bunch of Russian light cavalry officers who go off into the wilderness, gather up a bunch of peasants, and then start ambushing behind enemy lines. A pretty gruesome quote you can see from Baron Huxtable right there about how what would happen is the villages were so anxious to actually kill the prisoners that you could sell the peasants the prisoners because they would want to kill them so bad, and they'd gruesomely torture them to death. And here's a pretty interesting time frame. So you can see on October 19th, the French evacuate Moscow. On October 24th, you have the Battle of Napoleonic, which is between a lieutenant general and one of Napoleon's chief generals to vote on the Lusa River. And if you look at this map, again, Napoleon's trying to retreat this way, but at the battle right here, he gets caught by a detachment trying to cross this river. And he wins, again. I don't think he ever actually loses a battle during this entire campaign. But the problem is that he's winning it, but the Russians don't care if he wins or loses, because while this small detachment from the Russian army was fighting another small detachment from the French army, the main Russian army went up and set up right here with artillery. So that even if he wins here, sure, he can keep going this way, but they have artillery in all the key places that now if he goes this way, he's just going to bombard the crap out of them, and they're not going to be able to go anywhere. Or they're going to die if they try. So realizing that that's not an option, he has to go back the same way he came. As you can see from that map, it shows the deterioration of his forces. Starts off looking pretty great. You have a ton of men. Start losing a lot, and then by the time he gets past Napoleonic, he has 37,000 men left out of 422,000 to 600,000 men. That's a lot of people that just died. So this isn't super great for French morale. They're also surrounded by Cossacks. Also, the casualty rate from 600,000 to less than 35,000, to put it a little bit in perspective, if you look at the American forces during World War II, we lost combined and killed forces 400,000. So in one campaign, which is about from the middle of summer until the middle of winter, he lost the equivalent that the entire United States lost during World War II. Not such a great campaign for Napoleon. So, what exactly was going on during this campaign? Historian Zemosky believes that the partisan statistics were very embellished. He doesn't think that they actually played a key role in the war. He thinks that they were just kind of these guys who like to ride around, capture a few wagons, and then be like, oh, we killed a bunch of people, and we're really cool. The problem is that even Davidov admits to the embellishments, but there were fabricated numbers on all sides. And post the Battle of Vilna, Napoleon's officers led him to believe that he had 35,000 more troops than he actually had. And this is a really important part of the campaign, is that not only did he bring the wrong equipment, because he didn't have horseshoes, which is something that he really should have noticed, and a lot of historians say that Napoleon was great because he micromanaged. And he would notice small things like, oh, you guys have the wrong horseshoes, let's bring the right horseshoes. He didn't notice that. He also didn't notice that a lot of his officers were embellishing the numbers of people that they actually lost in the battle to make themselves look better. And the reason why a lot of historians think that he isn't noticing this is because he's so frustrated that the Russians won't stand and fight him. They keep retreating, and all he wants to do is have a battle, beat them, and then say, we win, now surrender. But the Russians aren't about that. They don't want to fight him. And even when he does fight and win, he loses significant numbers of his forces. And so it's very frustrating towards him. And you can see this in kind of the discourse and the way that he describes the irregular forces. He says that the Cossacks are cowards and wretches, scum of the earth. And then Davidov claims that Napoleon wrote, not one messenger was intercepted, not one transport seized. And so why is someone who's saying that they weren't even effective saying that they're also scum of the earth and that he despises them? Especially when previously he'd said that if he had Cossacks, would be able to travel all the world with them and conquer everywhere. The reason is probably because they had such a detrimental effect on his baggage campaign. So what you have is Napoleon's campaign brought the wrong horseshoes. Your artillery, already not very effective. Your baggage train, not going to be super effective when it's getting raided all the time by Cossacks on the retreat, which means that your troops have nobody to cover them, because all the horses and artillery are gone, and they don't have any food to sustain themselves, so you're starving to death. And this is really why the retreat costs so many lives. And Vossler said that you need 10,000 men just to forage for food, because if you don't have that number of men, what would end up happening is you'd get Cossacks coming out of the woods on horses and capturing a bunch of people. And even when you did have 10,000 men, it'd be a huge problem because, as Vossler notes, that even if you shouted the word Cossacks to a French baggage train, it would cause everyone to freak out and try to gather together in a formation. So much so that some people were actually trampled to death because they were afraid of the Cossacks coming out of the woods. And Berlin says that there were a vast network of Cossacks and armed peasants. And again, you can see from a bunch of other individuals that there was absolute lack of forage. So clearly Napoleon's whole adage of the army marches on its stomach, he didn't pay a lot of attention to it or was just caught in a situation in which there was no winning. So ultimately, if you look back at this campaign trail, he tries to get here, splits up his forces, keeps going, and when he arrives at Moscow, he takes Moscow and thinks that the war is going to be over. The war is not over. Tsar Alexander actually retreats, as I said before. And so what you end up having is a situation where it's Russian nationalism pitted against French nationalism. And what makes this so fascinating is that even when he loses pretty much all of his men, gets back here, he leaves the army and goes back to Paris. So he just leaves those guys sitting there to cross the river because he thinks that they're probably safe now. But it's interesting because he's done this before. Does anyone know where he's actually left the army in a pretty bad spot before and just been like, I'm going to go back to Paris? During his Egyptian campaign, when he found out that the British fleet was coming, he said, I'm out of here, guys. You do you. And he left the entire army there. They did pretty well for a while, but they were eventually all captured or killed. And so he has a tendency when he sees himself in a tight spot to try and find a way to survive himself, which is interesting because even though he does this, the soldiers still love him. As is evidence because when he returns to Paris, the reason why he wants to get there so quickly ahead of the news that he just got wiped out is because he raised 400,000 men in the next couple months. Because everyone signed on because they're like, oh yeah, Napoleon needs me in his army, not knowing that the previous army just got wrecked in Russia and went down from 600,000 men to about 28,000. So ultimately what this means is that he was able to have another 400,000 strong force to fight against the next coalition that actually came when you had a number of wars after this. You had the German Wars of Liberation. But it was pretty much all downhill from there because what the Russians had actually proved is that Napoleon isn't invincible. You see, even though they pretty much lost every battle that they actually engaged with Napoleon in, it still wasn't a victory for Napoleon overall. It was not a victorious campaign, and it really proved that he wasn't able to be the superhero that everyone in Europe thought he was. Because up until that time point, he had been absolutely demolishing every army he'd come into contact with. Which is why he was able to get this continental system in place, why he was able to build up such a strong French economic base. After this campaign, that really deteriorates the entirety of his continental system because nobody wants to sign on anymore when it's proven that pretty much everyone is united against him after this battle, after the series of campaigns. And after this, you can also see that he gets involved in the Peninsular War. That also doesn't go so well for him because the British land there at Gibraltar and start invading Spain. So at the end, in conclusion, you can see that Napoleon's campaign, while he might have thought it was a good idea to make sure that the continental system stayed in place, to make sure that Britain actually didn't gain any economic leverage over him, really didn't work out the way he expected. He made a lot of really crucial mistakes, and ultimately this ended up costing him the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Any questions?
So yeah, definitely it is a huge turning point in terms of history of French Napoleonic Revolution. But yes, it seems like it is not an obvious victory for Russia. But what is the eventual consequences or eventual historical significance impact upon the Russia after this?
On the Russians? The Russians ended up, and after this, they really started, because previously they didn't have a very modern army, and so every time they engaged with more modern forces from Britain and France, they kept getting their butts kicked, and eventually they figured out what was going on, And by the time of the 1850s with Tsar Nicholas II, you have the modernization of Russia. They are starting to get actual railroads. They're starting to look more like the American West and actually being a significant fighting force. And really after this battle, they're one of the only people that feel like we beat Napoleon. And so they become a very dominant land force that nobody wants to fight until you get the Crimean War later. Yeah, nobody wants to fight the Russians after this campaign.
All right. Excellent. Thank you.
Well,
Yeah, just ahead. Good.